Okay, so welcome everybody. I didn't start my career as an academic. I started my career as a gravedigger, and then I got into academia, and I started to actually researching castles. But when I think back to the days when I was a gravedigger, a lot of the gravediggers were quite old, and they were getting older. And I realized that if we don't record the stories of the gravediggers, um, we will lose that kind of knowledge of how graves are constructed. And actually, as archaeologists, we frequently say things about the dead, and we say that the dead don't bury themselves. It's the living that bury the dead. And the dead person doesn't really get a choice in what's put in the grave, and a lot of the things that are included in graves are not necessarily what maybe the person that was being buried wanted. So I started to ask these questions about grave digging, and actually I realized that from my grave digging days, actually a lot of people that from about the 17th century onwards, it's not the people that are burying the dead that actually the final contact with that person, that coffin, that body. It was actually the grave diggers. And I thought that actually we should investigate, doing a project investigating how grave digging works. A lot of people don't realize how people are buried, what goes into digging a grave, how graves are dug, how cemeteries are organized. It's sort of a mystery to most people until they have to unfortunately face the truth that one of their relatives or their friends has passed away, and then they've got to dig into that lore of into the cemetery and actually find out how the process works. And it's mainly a mystery to most people because it's normally handled by undertakers and that sort of thing. So this project essentially wanted to capture the knowledge, this surviving historical knowledge concerning the grave digging profession. And this is why we began this project, is essentially to talk to these old grave diggers. And the problem is that a lot of the old grave diggers are on the verge of or have just retired. And if we don't speak to them about the burial industry and how it works, we won't have this knowledge to pass on, because nowadays most graves, certainly the cemeteries we visited in our project, are machine cut. So basically most of the grave digging nowadays is dug by machine. So essentially we wanted to talk to the grave diggers whilst we still can about how grave digging was conducted in the older cemeteries in the past. And we need to know, basically as an archaeologist, I'm interested in what we say about the burial of the dead, because basically it's the grave diggers that have the final point of contact. It's the grave diggers that look after the graves. It's the grave diggers that look after the monuments. I know that it's stonemasons that actually work on the monuments, but it's the grave diggers that care for those monuments year round. So essentially, this is the reason that the project that we began this project, a project that is that we're in the process now of writing up, but we still are going to continue this project because we want to reach out to actually the north, up to Scotland, up to Wales, to try to understand if there's any difference in the regional if there's any regional variation in terms of how graves are how burials are treated and how the graves are dug. So what we were interested in was the traditional grave digging techniques, the role of the grave digger in their control and management of burial practice. We wanted to look at the tools and techniques that are employed by grave diggers when they cut the graves, when they backfill the graves, and when they reopen the graves, and actually also what part the grave diggers play in the role of the burial itself. Now when I was a grave digger myself, and we weren't even allowed to come out of the shed during the funeral. Yeah, I've noticed, unfortunately for me, I lost my father a couple of weeks ago and I went to his cremation recently, but I was in the cemetery where the crematorium was down in Dorset. And I noticed that the grave diggers were not in a shed or out of sight during the funeral. And in fact, at the graveside of a very recent funeral I saw, they had music playing and people dancing, and that's a really far cry from when I was in the cemetery in the 1980s. So we were trying to get an understanding of how and what the gravediggers do during the funeral, and actually some of the stories about gravedigging and gravedigging practices in the past. And then we wanted to look at the reopening of graves, which most gravediggers, including me, it's a very unsavoury process if you've got to reopen a grave. And actually, we've also discovered that you know, this practice is happening more and more. Because people are taking their loved ones with them and moving them from cemetery to cemetery, which is a new thing. For you know, basically, a lot of people think that you used to buy your grave in perpetuity. Certainly, the Victorians did. They bought their cemetery indefinitely and thought the plot was theirs forever. And you know, we've got modern cemetery owners now complaining at the fact that they're still tied up with all this Victorian law about reburying more people in those plots. So we're looking at a variety of grave practices, grave types, exhumation practice, the role of the gravedigger as a caretaker of cemetery space, and also Helen looked at occupational folklore around the grave digging practice.
Is it worth me just saying a few words
Absolutely,
about that, Stuart?
please do.
Okay, so hello everyone. As Elizabeth explained, I'm a historian and folklorist. So I came into the project to help with the oral history side of things, the interviewing. I also went back into our case study local authorities archives, in particular the Burial Board minute books, to form a picture of the sites we were looking at and the sort of the historical development as much as we could tell of the tools and techniques. Also, when it came to the analysis of the interview data, my sort of expertise in folklore proved very useful, because what we got back was what seemed to be a repetition of lots of different sort of tropes and time when narratives and so on. Initially, this was a little bit disappointing. And then thankfully my folklorist's mind got on the problem, and what I realised that what we were dealing with here was a series of sort of pieces of occupational folklore, basically informal occupational culture you might want to call it, and whereby our interviewees were selecting and repeating to themselves and among themselves and to us as researchers things that they considered important and that really belied their shared occupational values. So there was that sort of element of discourse analysis to it all as well. So there's quite a lot of different sort of levels and dimensions to this project. So on that note, I'm going to just to sort of give you some context, start to unpack that historical operational legacy. I'm going to take you on a little tour of the cemeteries that fall within the purview of our test case local authority, which was the city of Bristol, which is where both Stuart and I are based. And I should say from here that all images in the presentation from here are ours, unless they are otherwise credited. So the first stop on our tour and the first cemetery to open in Bristol was Arnolds Vale, opened in 1839 by the Bristol General Cemetery Company. This is a very early image, we think dated sort of 1840s, possibly 1850s. It's, as you can see, it's very different now. It's much more sort of full and grown over, and it would have been designed as a garden cemetery, as a peaceful and uplifting green space, in marked contrast to the overcrowded and rather noxious parish burial grounds of central Bristol at the time. In the 20th century, Arnos Vale experienced, like many similar sites, a long period of decline as the cemetery filled up and income went down accordingly. The owners, and this is a theme that comes up a few times, they tried repeatedly to get the corporation to take the site over, and matters eventually came to a head in 2003 when the council compulsorily purchased the site after the then owner had threatened to sell it off for development. And the council ran the site directly for a couple of years before handing over to a trust, which the trust now operates. It's a leisure venue It's done some quite sort of innovative things in terms of sort of attracting visitors and developing it as a heritage site, but it is also an active burial ground as well. Some of our gravediggers indeed had worked there during that brief period when it was directly operated by the council, and expressed some quite strong views about the hilly and inaccessible nature of this particular site, the abundance of vegetation, that lovely garden cemetery, ivy run wild, and also about the work standards of some of their predecessors as well. The first cemetery, however, to be acquired by Bristol Corporation was Greenbank, which happens also to be my local cemetery, so I'm rather fond of it. It was opened in 1871 to serve the parish of St Philip and St Jacob, and it was acquired by the corporation in 1895. And by 1910, which is the approximate date of the photo on the left hand, it had already been extended twice actually, and indeed Greenbank Road had been rerouted to accommodate the cemetery, which is difficult to imagine happening nowadays. This photo shows a cemetery lodge, which was traditionally inhabited by the superintendent. And he would have managed day-to-day operations, including staff, the gravediggers, the gardeners, the clerical staff. Nowadays, all that staffing is centralised, but in a lovely continuity, the Greenbank site supervisor who we interviewed still lived at the time of our interviews in the cemetery lodge. The photo on the right hand was taken a little bit later in 1929, and the foreground shows a formal flower garden, which isn't there now. That would have been tended by a team of gardeners, so there was a distinction between gardeners and gravediggers in those days, which there isn't now. They've all been merged, I think, since the 1990s into general cemetery operatives. But quite a lot of our gravediggers are still from a landscaping and gardening kind of background, which again was a nice and striking continuity. In the background of this photo, you can see the monuments are very tightly packed in. They're not like that now. There was a programme of clearance in the 1980s, and one of our interviewees had actually been involved in that process. And again, I think this really underlines what Stuart just said about the need to capture these memories from quite a long time ago now, before they're lost. So our next cemetery then was Avon View, which was opened in 1883 by the St George Board of Health, and it was acquired by Bristol Corporation in 1897 due to boundary changes. So the city, like many at the time, was rapidly expanding, and this was often a way in which local corporations acquired cemetery sites. And right from the start, there were problems at this site, quite clearly seen in the burial board minute books, with hard and rocky ground. And there's a bit of a saga which goes on across several editions of the books about the gravedigger George Jones, who repeatedly asked for pay rises because of the difficulty of working this hard ground, and eventually, quote, threw up the work, which I think is nice polite committee speak for walked out. The next site to be acquired was Shyhampton in 1904. It had actually been opened in 1898. And it was expanded pretty soon afterwards in 1907 due to demand. Due to lack of space, this particular site, like many of its kind, nowadays it just takes additional reopeners, and we'll talk a bit more about those later in the presentation of existing graves for additional burials. It looks like 1904 was actually a pretty busy year for the burial board, because that was the same year that they also acquired Canford, in Westbury-on-Trim in the north of the city. And nowadays this remains the northern hub for the council's cemeteries operation. It's also incidentally home to Bristol's first working crematorium, which was opened in 1956. And Canford is really significant in our tale. And again, it's the theme of sort of hard and rocky ground, because it was here that we see the first introduction in this area of mechanical digging equipment, which was both a little bit earlier and a little bit later than we thought it might be. So looking to extend the site again, the corporation spent most of the 1920s in very protracted negotiations with neighbouring landowners. And having eventually acquired the site, it very quickly became apparent that the ground was just really consisted of solid bedrock. Now, at the time, the usual method of dealing with this particular problem was to crack the rock manually with a pickaxe and then insert small explosive charges into those cracks and detonate them. And quite a few of our gravediggers, despite never having seen this for themselves, they spoke very fondly of it. So it was clearly something that had been sort of picked up on and passed down the generations and meant something to them in terms of the, I think, sort of the excitement and the danger of the job sometimes. So anyway, the extent of the bedrock at Canford required something a little bit more radical. So in 1933, the burial board spent what was at the time the pretty whopping sum of £13,000 in today's money on a mechanical drill. Someone looked at the roads department and had the bright idea that this might help us. And indeed it did, although having solved one problem, it inevitably caused another. That of disruption to the local neighbours. And in fact, from the early 60s, there's a particularly interesting and fraught series of correspondence between the cemetery authorities and the residents in the surrounding roads who were complaining about the noise. One letter said that this is a highly rated area and you will agree it is unfair. You can almost hear the indignation bubbling off the page, that we are unable to rest in our gardens on fine days. So anyway, they tried all sorts of solutions. They tried baffling the generators, which just caused them to overheat. Yes, Stuart.
Can I just chip in and say that using a mechanical jackhammer at the bottom of the grave is a terrifying experience as well.
I can well believe it, Stuart. And from the sound of this correspondence, it was also quite a terrifying experience for everybody around. So yes, they tried baffling the generators, which just caused them to overheat. They tried keeping them in sheds, which meant that the pressure lines were too long, so you couldn't get the pressure to use the drills. And this is, I think, a particularly clear example of how these can be sometimes quite contested spaces between the needs of different users, whether that's the local residents, people passing through for various reasons, people visiting the cemetery for sort of purposes of commemoration, or indeed the cemetery as a working space, as we're going to explore it predominantly tonight. Rocky ground was also an issue at Brislington Cemetery in the south of Bristol, and in fact such was the problem here that some of the graves had to be lined with bricks for safety purposes. This is another cemetery that the corporation acquired as a result of boundary changes, this time in 1933. And this is one of the much smaller sites in the nowadays council's portfolio. To give you an idea, the year after it was acquired, they had only 43 burials that year compared to nearly 1,400 at Greenbank. So it's a very small site and it's very quiet. Apart from very occasional reopeners, it's mainly maintenance at this site, which our gravediggers are also responsible for. Now, Bristol Corporation and then City Council, it has acquired its cemeteries over the years with it has to be said, varying degrees of willingness. The corporation was especially reluctant to take on Ridgeway Park, again in the north-east of the city. By 1950, this cemetery, which had been opened by a private company in 1888, it was almost full and it was in very, very poor condition. And since the 1920s, you can see in the minute books there's repeated attempts, again, as with Arnolds Vale, by the owners to persuade the corporation to take it over. And each time, again, it's all sort of done in terribly polite committee speak, but the corporation is clearly recognising this site for the white elephant it is and saying, no, I don't think so, thank you very much. But actually, councils can and still can legally be forced to take on the upkeep of cemetery sites as the provider of last resort, and that's actually what happened in this case in 1954. And the corporation came very close to closing this site altogether, but they decided to keep it open for reopeners. This is a particularly good illustration, this site, of a problem with sort of working in legacy sites, that sometimes the records aren't quite as one would wish. And in fact, the records for Ridgeway Park were all lost at some point in the 1940s. We don't quite know why, but what it does mean that customers who wish to reopen and use an old grave at this site are required to purchase an indemnity against council against the disturbance accidentally of unrecorded remains, or any dispute concerning the grave rights. But the corporation wasn't done acquiring cemeteries yet, because in 1963 it formally acquired the cemetery at Henbury. Henbury is a slightly unusual one in its own way. It was actually originally the parish cemetery, and it was on land given for that purpose by the Harfords of Blaise Castle. The corporation had maintained it for the diocese since the mid-50s, but in 1963 it was formally conveyed to the council. That's quite unusual, given that councils can, as we said, be anyway forced to take cemeteries on as the provider and maintainer of last resort. It's unusual for that kind of formal conveyance process to happen, but it did in this case. So like most burial authorities, Bristol Council has got quite a considerable tail of legacy sites, and that affects the way in which these sites are maintained and managed. It does, however, have in its portfolio one site that it planned and built itself. This is South Bristol, and this is the southern hub for operations today. Plans for a new cemetery had in fact been afoot from the mid-1950s, and it's very clear, looking at the sort of discussions that took place around that, this was planned from the start to be a modern lawn style cemetery. So it's purposely designed to be efficiently and rationally maintained with mechanical equipment. And so we'll tease out some of those differences between the garden and the lawn style cemeteries and the needs and demands that brings as we go along. It's also the site of Bristol's other active crematorium, which opened a year before the cemetery, which perhaps reflect the fact that this is a time when cremation is becoming the majority option. But I mean, that said, just under 25% of bodily disposals per year are still by burial. That's quite a sizable number. There's about 600,000 deaths a year. So the gravedigger still has an important role to play in caretaking the dead, and as we'll see, the living too. So I'm now going to hand back to Stuart, who'll start us off talking a little bit more about that.
Okay, so basically, as I said to you before, I was a gravedigger, and I wanted to try to understand the process of grading. Having done it myself, I kind of was at best in a good place to talk to the gravediggers, and Helen got a different view from the gravediggers on how they do their work, and because I knew some of the phrases that these guys use, and it was all guys, by the way, that we interviewed rather than gals as well, but basically I wanted to understand how maybe it had changed and developed, because I was in the profession in the 80s. I wanted to see how it had changed over the last few years. And basically, when we were working, I was based in Yeovil Cemetery, Preston Road Cemetery, which started in the Victorian period, but it goes all the way through to the present day, and it's still an active burial ground. But essentially, I was looking to see how, and I remember being taken down to Bournemouth Cemetery and actually being shown the mechanical diggers, and how basically we could, if we wanted to, take up the offer of learning how to drive diggers, and actually learn the process of, but because it wasn't a lawn cemetery, there were lots and lots of curbs and Victorian headstones and Victorian monuments. We decided that it really wasn't really appropriate for the cemetery that we worked in. But that's what's happened. So essentially, before the 1990s, all graves were hand dug. A lot of the reopeners have to be hand dug because you are working in a cemetery that's Victorian or that's or from the 1940s, 60s or whatever. But essentially, we were looking at all sorts of. So what I wanted to do was to interview these gravediggers and actually see what their training was and how they got trained. And now I remember that I didn't get any training. Basically, I started on day one, and I was taken out by an experienced gravedigger, and I was shown the ropes. How do you dig a grave? What do you do? And it is exactly the same thing today. You know, so basically, apart from the machine driving, which has been introduced, yeah, so you've got to be a trained professional to drive a machine, so you've got to get your machine driving license. But essentially, the grave digging skills are pretty much the same. So basically, as it says on that slide, you were given the training by the old boy that showed you the ropes. So this is exactly the same in my day. The grave typically took 2 to 3 days to dig, unless you hit rock, and this is when you have to send out for the mechanical help that you need, the jackhammer, essentially, and you need to get the jackhammer in and get it into the grave. But that grave that the gentleman standing in there doesn't show the use of any shoring. And essentially, it was the shoring. All graves today are shored, you know. So basically, in order to protect the digger, it needs to be a shored grave. So if you don't hit rock and you don't have to get the jackhammer in, then it will take 2 to 3 days to dig the grave. If you're digging a reopener, it's a bit less. It's a bit of it takes a bit less, essentially. All graves, normally, 8 foot long, 6 foot deep, and normally 6 foot deep is really the maximum. 6'3" is the maximum they dig to today. But when I started back in the 80s, you used to get graves that were down to 12 feet. Yeah. And I'll tell you, there is nothing more terrifying than being at the bottom of a 12-foot hole and looking up, and the only thing you can see above your head is a patch of coffin-shaped sky, right? When you're 12 foot down in a hole, and the only way to get out is a really long ladder, it's a terrifying experience. And when I first started doing the job, there wasn't the shoring was introduced when I was working in the cemetery, essentially. So, we had to learn how to use the shoring, and actually, learn how to insert it, etc., etc.
I think we've got some pictures of it coming up later on. It's
a physically demanding job. I was very, very fit back then. I had big shoulders and big arms. The first few weeks in the cemetery nearly killed me in terms of my body. I went home, fell straight to sleep, and the next thing you have to get out and go to work again. So we were also interested in how does it feel to be a gravedigger, and what do these guys feel? And actually, what was really interesting was that most of them basically tried to divorce their feeling for the job they were undertaking by saying, as far as they were concerned, they were just burying a box. Yeah. So rather than thinking about the deceased person or trying to take part in a funeral in any way, they were just burying a box, and that's how they kind of separated themselves mentally away from the job that they were conducting. But it changes when you're doing a reopener and you actually might see some human remains, and that's when it gets a bit more tricky, and the grave diggers themselves viewed it as some sort of rite of passage. We know the width of the grave is vitally important. We know that basically when you're digging a grave, what they do is they measure the plot. So essentially, this is the lawn cemetery we were in. So essentially, we know that this cemetery was designed to take as many bodies as possible. But we know also that within the next 20 years, and importantly, because this is going to be something that's going to be coming more to the fore in the next few years, we know that cemeteries are rapidly running out of space, right? And in the next 20 years, there's going to be a big debate over what we do for future cemetery space. So one of the things that if do we to use lawn cemeteries? Is it the best use of space, or do we look for other means of? And there are lots and lots of machine, so there's things like exhumation and stuff like that, which I'm sure Helen and I will explain a bit later on. But essentially, this is about the coffin. So essentially, the tins you see there are put in front of a wooden box, or underneath where the soil is chucked, from the grave that's being dug. Next one, Helen, please.
You'll see that we're as you go through, we're deliberately showing you sort of photos that really emphasise the industrial nature of the site, which is I think something that our gravediggers said was sort of often quite shocking to visitors.
Absolutely.
Could I also sort of mention, in terms of the sort of the grave measuring, one thing we did pick up on was a little bit of sense of conflict, professional conflict sometimes with funeral directors. Because one thing gravediggers want to avoid is what's called sticky, where you get to the funeral and the coffin won't go in because the grave hasn't been dug to the correct size. And this is the sort of this really kind of sits at odds with all sorts of professional values around kind of managing the event, managing the emotions around it, keeping the show on the road, professionalism, autonomy, all that sort of thing. So most of them were at pains to tell us that when they get the measurements from the funeral director, they actually add quite a lot on, because they would rather dig out too much than have the dreaded sticky on the day, because that's the absolute professional nightmare.
One of my jobs was actually going down to the undertakers, and actually if the undertaker hadn't given us measurements, we'd actually have to go and measure the or get the measurements themselves, or even measure the body to work out the size of the coffin in order to make sure that we dig the right size grave. And actually we did occasionally have a coffin that came a lot bigger than we were expecting, and that was one of the issues. If you get the coffin stuck in the grave, and then it becomes a traumatic experience for the people, the family members standing around that grave. And this is something that the grave diggers are at pains to avoid at all costs, because they don't want a coffin to get stuck. So those wooden boxes are actually used. So in other words, again, not to come into conflict with the undertaker or the owner of the next grave. So essentially, you've got to protect the headstone next to the grave that you are cutting. So essentially, in Bristol, they use these wooden boxes to cover the existing headstone so that they can dig the grave next to basically where the new interment is going in. Yeah, so these are basically used to protect headstones, and these were made on site. So essentially, these not only did the grave diggers have the role of protecting the grave, but actually they were making stuff to actually aid them in the task of protecting the grave next door. And actually, this becomes a problem, because actually, what a lot of the time you've got to put your spoil, so basically the stuff you dig out of the grave to put the body in. This upcast of stuff, this soil, basically has to go on top of the previous person's grave if you've got a grave on either side. Yeah, that does very often happen. So essentially, you've got to choose one grave or the other. You get in touch with both families and say, do you mind if we've got to dig another grave in the middle between two plots? Do you mind if we put the soil on top of your grave? And a lot of families don't want that to happen. So that becomes another problem that the grave diggers face and have to deal with. How do they protect the grave? And that sheet of tin that we showed you goes on top of the graves. Yeah, on top of wood, obviously, and then the spoil from the grave, or the soil from the grave, gets put on top of that sheet of tin, and it gets covered with a grass mat, and then the funeral can take place. Next one, Helen. Okay, this is what a freshly dug grave looks like. You can see the spoil being held up with boxes with big bits of hardboard. That the dug grave with a so that nobody falls into that grave. When it's open, they've got some sort of coffin cover on the top that they can open. Basically, this is the way that a freshly dug grave will look. I think the next slide shows one that is dug, isn't it? Oh no, these are the tools. Okay, some of the tools are normal shovels and spades, but actually there were a couple that we found that were actually especially modified tools from the grave diggers themselves. So they basically modified bits of machinery that were laying around. And actually, that's an old thing from the end of a jackhammer that they've modified to dig to make a smaller spade that they could actually use for burying ashes. So that was actually used for putting ashes in the ground, or actually, and one of the most problematic jobs is actually digging the grave of a child. Yeah, and actually, when you've got a tiny little box, no gravedigger could stand there, and they all had their cap in hand, feeling very sorrowful when it was ever a burial of a child. So these small graves always used to bring the emotions to the fore for any gravedigger. They still do, obviously. Next slide, Helen.
Well, can I just say before we do that, Stuart, that these photos of the tool sheds always remind me to sort of think about the kind of spatial organisation of this particular workplace, because Stuart mentioned earlier that the gravediggers, although they told us many of the same sort of items, that they did so in very different ways. So Stuart was very sort of clearly one of them, and I was a nice young lady from the university who had the license to ask silly questions and say, "I'm so sorry, can you tell me just again what a reopener is?" And one of the sort of other manifestations of this was that while Stuart was allowed in the tool sheds to take photographs, I wasn't. And in fact, I think Stuart remembers this. I remember Stuart coming over to say,
a division of labour.
Yeah, and I remember Stuart saying, "Don't, whatever you do, ask to see the tool sheds." so yeah, I think it was just sort of like something quite interesting about the kind of the very close nature of that occupational community. So this is an example of a type of JCB digger that's routinely used.
Yeah, that's not the one that they would genuinely use to cut the graves. Actually, it's the one with the arm that usually that's used. This is the one they use for backfilling. Yeah, but essentially, this is the machine that's replaced the traditional gravedigger, but not in our older cemeteries, because you cannot drive one of these down through the rows of the older cemeteries, and that's the thing that stops them. So the lawn cemetery has been purposely designed. You've got a headstone and you've got a footstone. So basically, in the lawn cemeteries, a lot of the time the headstones and the two headstones are back to back. So essentially, you have a headstone, or you've got in the next one, in the next row, you've got the footstone. So basically, the person's buried with a headstone at the other end of the grave. So basically, that allows a big 12-foot row, so that you can drive these big machines down in order to dig the graves. And that's basically the machinery itself has led to the changes in cemetery layouts, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, so this is the shoring that these guys put in the ground. So essentially, they put in a big metal box now, which is lifted in because they've got a JCB now, and they can lift these things in with a JCB. You put the shoring in, all the ribs, and the coffin goes down, and obviously the graves dig a bit bigger, and because it's mechanically dug now, they can dig it a bit bigger, and they've got the metal box in, and basically this is how these modern graves are dug, whereas before you're not actually seeing the soil when you look into a grave. When you're but this is how you protect the worker anyway. Next one, please, Helen.
It's also probably worth saying that when you look back through the burial boards, in up until about the 1970s, the burial board was directly involved in equipment purchases, so you can track what's being bought. And there are regular purchase of elm, what are called strainers, which we think are wooden ribs and the sort of the predecessors to the kind of equipment that you see here. They also talked about using apparently some very sort of whizzy hydraulic shoring that can be used as well. And as with all these things, it's a case of the equipment is there, but it's a question of whether the budget allows.
There were some 19th century illustrations of safety mechanisms for grave digging.
Yes.
But I don't think many of the burial authorities ever invested in or even could afford them. Yeah. They were quite wild and wacky inventions, which had a limited market. Should we say? All right.
Quite.
Yeah.
Okay, next slide.
That's the grave. That's one of those boxes lifted out.
Again, quite perhaps quite surprisingly industrial.
Yes, indeed.
So this is looking down into a grave to give you an idea how the shoring and the grave frame and the surrounds all sit together. And as the caption says, most graves these days are what they call new for twos. So they're 6 foot deep and they're designed for 2 occupiers. And I suspect our test case authority might have shot themselves in the foot a bit and inadvertently contributed toward the burial shortage issue, because in I think it was the late 50s, they took a decision that they were no longer going to do graves for 3 or more occupants, because they judged that cremation was inevitably and inexorably going to become the universal option within a short period of time. And they were also noting social change at this period, that families were more dispersed, people weren't around to maintain the graves.
What they didn't foresee are people taking their loved ones out of the ground and moving into the cemetery nearer to them, to their new
Indeed.
home. Yeah.
Indeed, that is quite an interesting trend we will touch on later on. And you look back at these minute books and you think, oh, if only they'd known what they were doing. But there you go. That's the benefit of hindsight, I think. So here's just another shot of the
to stop people falling in, essentially, whilst it remains open. So basically, and one of the things I normally say is that before a bank holiday, take note, people, because it is one, certainly for us over here. Normally before a bank holiday, we always dig a couple of extra graves, because we know that people will do things normally that they don't undertake, cutting hedges with electric cables, etc., etc. And we know that after a bank holiday, we'd always get a couple of extra burials coming in. Yeah, so we'd normally dig a couple of extra holes over the bank holiday period, because we know that we'd get a couple of extra funerals coming in as a result. So that's just a little warning, bank holiday warning, just to make you aware. Yeah, but basically, you know, there might be an open grave waiting for somebody, but you know, please don't let it be anybody here. Right, next slide.
Perhaps now is a time to say as well that obviously this site is used by a range of sort of ethnic and cultural groups.
Absolutely.
Some of whom have very sort of particular requirements for speedy burial. So they manage this demand by always having a few prepared in advance. And in fact, there was a bit of a superstition they told us about, where you're not allowed to mention the area of the cemetery concerned, because otherwise, if you say it, you will get one and you will have to stay late to fill the grave in. Next slide.
So yeah, basically we try to make the grave as presentable as possible, you know. So, you know, we cover the wooden planks with matting, and we cover the soil with matting. We have the grave diggers on hand in case anything goes wrong, all graves. But basically, you know, it normally takes 2 or 3 hours to backfill, but you just saw that mechanical digger. You know, and if the guys can't get in to do it themselves, then they can just use one of those huge machines to backfill the grave really quickly. But you know, if you're doing backfilling by hand, it takes a couple, 2 to 3 hours to backfill. And actually, we've given you already an insight into what happens if a coffin gets stuck. But essentially, the grave diggers are there in case anything goes wrong, and you know, they need to get in the hole actually, and you know, just tease out a bit of stone that's making the coffin get sticky or get stuck on the sides, and help the coffin get to its final resting place at the bottom of the grave. And then normally the grave diggers will disappear again back into a shed or back out of sight. Although, as I said, I saw one recently where the grave diggers were very much on view, and actually they were kind of just standing aside while people had a party around that grave. So I think things have changed again, certainly down in Dorset anyway. And then that's again another slide, another one of those lockable covers. But essentially, you know, I think we're going to go on to reopeners. We've got reopener slide. Yeah. So okay. So basically, one of the things that grave diggers have to do is to continually top up the plot, because the ground will settle for a lot. You know, actually, we were trying to work out. Because essentially you've got 2 periods of settlement. The first one when the coffin is freshly buried or first put into the ground, and then when eventually the water does its thing, and the coffin disintegrates, the soil will sink again. So essentially there are 2 periods in which And actually, because of the modern makeup of coffins that are being used today, they're not solid oak boxes, you know. So I dug a grave for a sister of a nun, and the sister was buried 100 years before it sounds ridiculous, but basically it's this really old lady who died, and she wanted to be buried with her sister, and the grave was well over 100 years old. And basically when we dug down to the coffin, yeah, the sister had died almost 100 years before the sister that was being put into the grave. Okay. And that, it's amazing how much the coffins will sink. The coffin collapsing will make the soil go down. So basically these modern coffins aren't up to scratch. And so basically there are two periods where the coffin first goes into the ground and you have to keep continually topping up, and then when the coffin deteriorates over age, the ground will sink again. And so this is the grave digger's job, is to continually maintain this grave so that the ground on the surface continues to remain level. And it's something that we have to do all the time as something that we have to do as grave diggers all the time.
And we already talked about infant burials as well, and how this is a notable exception to the rule of dissociation.
And you can see how that small spade that I showed you in the previous picture would be ideal for cutting that hole for that small coffin. The other exception to the rule is that that there are different burial practices. Different people have different burial practices. So the Plymouth Brethren and the Black African Caribbean communities generally backfill the graves themselves, which is a boon for the grave digger, because he doesn't have to backfill the grave himself. And the gypsy and traveller communities generally have brick-lined vaults, where the coffin, where no mud is allowed to touch the coffin, and the casket is sealed in a brick vault. So basically, not only do you have to dig a grave for the deceased, but you've also got to make it big enough that you can build into that grave some infrastructure, and you've got to get somebody that knows about lining a grave with bricks. And as I say, the Muslim community don't like the coffin touching their casket either. And again, the graves are lined with a timber box before they're buried.
Yeah, so the grave diggers sort of made quite a thing in the interviews about having to be sensitive to all these sort of needs of different user groups, and how they sometimes might conflict a bit within the site. Another issue which exercised them a great deal was around the decoration of graves, because and there were quite a lot of sort of time when type narratives about items being stolen, about one person's lovely decoration and tribute being another's Poundland tat, about the different trends in grave decoration. At the time we were interviewing, LED lights were apparently the in thing. And again, this is something you can track back in the records as well. There are instances from the sort of 1880s and 90s of young girls being arrested for stealing the ribbons on the grave and so on. So again, that those kind of conflicts which arise between different users
was people complaining that their flowers had been eaten, and actually it was we've got deer in a lot of the cemeteries, and actually the flowers were being eaten by deer. And the only way that they could prove to the individuals that it was the deer that were eating the flowers, or actually they bought some of those motion sensitive cameras and actually had footage of the deer eating these people's flowers. It's the only way that they could be believed.
So it's an area of huge sensitivity, and people are very quick to blame the cemetery staff when things don't go quite right.
Exhumation is like a rite of passage, so they don't normally give exhumations to the new people on the staff. Normally exhumations are handled by more experienced grave diggers, because it is a relatively unpleasant job. So essentially, when you're doing an exhumation, you might get a glimpse of the body. The one thing that everyone always goes on about is the smell when you do an exhumation. It's not a very particularly nice job to do. You have to do it at unsociable hours, mainly when we used to do it in the cemetery that I worked in. It had to do through the night, so you'd have to go in at night. You know, you'd have to do a night shift, and you'd have to be there on hand. You'd uncover the coffin, and then the police or the coroner would basically help you to winch the coffin out of the grave, and actually hopefully the coffin won't collapse. But because of the modern materials that these coffins are being made from, they're not solid oak coffins anymore. And that's what I was going back to, that story about the solid oak coffin. You know, basically these solid oak coffins stood the test of time. And when we dug down to the coffin, it was completely intact. But the modern coffins are just not, you know, they're basically made of chipboard. So you give it 20 years and basically the grave will go down again because the coffin has collapsed. And so you know, you can't leave a grave for more than about 10 years now. And if you've got an exhumation 10 years, you know, from somebody from 10 years previous, you're probably looking at actually excavating the body, rather than lifting just a box out of the ground. And that's when the older grave diggers will step in and say, no, I'm not going to give this to you because it's going to be too much for you to deal with. So, you know, they basically say no, you know, but it becomes a rite of passage to do an exhumation. So the other things are, you know, when you're looking at one of the things that Helen indicated in her opening slides is the fact that one of the biggest problems is, you know, with the depth of the grave, solid geology and the type of soils. Is it waterlogged or not? We had waterlogging. We had some sections of waterlogging where you know, you don't want your coffin to be floating in water. You know, so you can't lower someone into a grave full of water. It would be the family would be horrified, you know. So essentially, you know, that's one of the issues, you know, with this floating box. You know, so again, it's an issue that you've got to overcome. You do get occasionally stray bones being excavated by animals. Badgers are ferocious diggers, and basically bones occasionally get scattered around a cemetery. But you know, this is one of the things that the gravediggers deal with all the time. You know, when the last person in that grave is almost certainly going to be the gravedigger themselves. You know, if anybody's going to put the final bits and pieces in that grave, it will be the gravedigger, not the family. This is what I came to at the start. You know, so essentially, it's normally the gravediggers themselves that protect the coffin. It's normally the gravediggers that rearrange the grave goods before backfilling. So essentially, when the archaeologists are talking about death and burial, and it's not the dead, it's the family that bury the people, but it will be the gravediggers from the 17th century onwards that actually rearrange these funerary monuments or these funerary bits and pieces. And that will have an impact on what archaeologists in the future uncover of these graves. It will be the gravedigger that has the final say, essentially. Helen touched on this point already. Reopeners now have to be substantially wider because people are now generally bigger. You know, so basically, graves sink need topping up for 100 years after burial, but the reopeners have to be bigger than previous. You know, so basically, graves are being bigger and bigger because we are getting bigger and bigger as a population, or larger and larger in size as a population. Yeah.
Indeed, and they went into quite some detail about the technique where you sort of dig down the centre of the grave and then you go out until you find the original edges and then you go out a bit more.
That's it.
We tried to explore with them some stuff around this, but
they all didn't want to talk about what they may have seen. They did say that they'd seen things, but they wouldn't. That, you know, they talked about feelings, they talked about emotions, but they wouldn't go into stories about what they may or may not have seen. Yeah,
I think that comes back to that sort of the way that people present and construct them in interviews, and perhaps the impression that they wanted to portray of the profession as well. So there's always those kind of meta levels to what's going on in this kind of research. So this is just really to flag up the sort of issues that we've raised before about the future sustainability and use of these sites. We noted that Bristol's oldest garden cemetery, Arnos Vale, has been given some new life as a leisure venue. They have the usual programme of tours and talks that you'd expect, but they also do things like film screenings, functions, yoga classes, death cafes, all sorts really. So it will be interesting to see how different sites develop and maintain themselves in the future.
And my final point is to say that one of the things we were looking at is whether or not cemeteries may go back to the idea of going back to using ossuaries. Yeah. So essentially, could we start to use the sort of medieval ossuary again, where the remains that are still in the grave, if we have to dig up graves in order to rebury and reuse the burial sites, could we use an ossuary to put the remaining people's remains in, so that anybody that remembers the people could go to the ossuary rather than the grave that the person used to be in. And this is something that we are hoping to explore a bit further with our continual work. Yeah, and see whether there's any appetite for an ossuary. And certainly, there's medieval ossuaries still in existence in the UK, but I don't know whether the people today will accept a medieval ossuary in their current cemetery.